Hey everybody, welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed, the television edition. Good to be with you. It is happy spring, everybody. I know it's technically not spring yet, but if you happen to be watching this live on Wednesday afternoon, it is, where I am, it's about 55 degrees, so I'll take it. I've been running around with no coat on today, but I did put a coat on for the show. I do that for all of you. You probably don't really give a crap if I wear one or not. But anyway, so maybe I really just do it for me. I like to think that you all care whether or not I wear one, and it makes me feel good. It's just self-aggrandizement. Whatever. Hey, so welcome. Before we get into, I have something really important I want to discuss today. This is an issue that it's probably the biggest, well, aside from the Hillary Clinton stuff, it's probably the biggest political issue happening right now. And I have a lot to say about it. But before we do that, so last weekend, Jen Coffey and I were at Liberty Forum, representing IPM Nation, and of course Matt Connarton Unleashed, and we recorded a series of interviews. Liberty Forum, of course, was right here in Manchester, New Hampshire, where we broadcast from at the Radisson. Really great time. It's a multi-day annual event. We did have some guests on the show leading up to Liberty Forum talking about it. So Jen and I were there and recorded a bunch of stuff that's going to air this coming Sunday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the new IPM Nation live station, where we broadcast from the Uptown Auto Repair Studios in Manchester, New Hampshire. And we're going to air a special edition of Unleashed this coming Sunday night at 10 on the live station, where we're going to play for you the interviews, some really interesting conversations that we had with various people who were there. People, representing the Free State Project, people, friends of the Free State Project, people who, of all political stripes, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Independents like myself, who are just interested in issues concerning liberty and whatnot. Really, really cool event. And like I said, we had some really interesting conversations with some people, and we're very excited to share those with you. So this will not be on DKRN.FM. The radio edition of the show typically airs live on DKRN.FM every Tuesday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, and that will continue. But for this special, we're running this exclusively on the IPM Nation live station this coming Sunday night at 10. And I have to pause. I don't know if you can tell, my throat is scratchy. I'm just getting over a cold, so I'm going to be drinking a lot of water today. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. I have my Rubio water. And of course, Rubio water can only be consumed while attempting to maintain eye contact with the camera as awkwardly as possible. This is very important. That's really the key to enjoying a good gallon or cup, or however you choose to consume it. I came in with a gallon of Rubio water. Oh, that's good. I'm ready to give a rebuttal to the president's State of the Union. Okay. Sorry if the joke seems dated. I know it's a couple of years old now, but it's still funny to me. And my throat's killing me. Anyway. All right. The throat is scratchy, but my will is strong, as I said on Facebook. So what has occurred is, for those who haven't been paying attention, is that, the president, the Obama administration is currently in the throes of attempting to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. I say we as in, I think most people generally agree that Iran with nuclear weapons isn't necessarily a great idea. So there have been these negotiations going on, and it seems like around this particular set of negotiations, unlike some of the previous negotiations, six-party talks, et cetera, that have gone on over the various administrations, and this has been going on for a very long time. Obviously, this predates Obama by decades. But there had been what I perceive as a sense of optimism around this particular set of negotiations. We might really get somewhere. Iran's line has always been, well, we don't want to make weapons. We just want to be able to build nuclear reactors and such. which in theory sounds fine, except this same country, members of its leadership make statements about Israel needs to not exist. It should be incinerated, whatever they say, various statements that they've made. And that causes concern. But, these negotiations sound like they were going well, reasonably well. And then the Republicans threw a big monkey wrench into the whole thing when 47 Senate Republicans issued, the letter itself, I guess, was written by Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton. But these 47 senators all signed on to it. This open letter to the leadership of Iran, basically saying, and we'll read the actual letter in a moment, but basically saying, whatever deal you guys make with Obama really is irrelevant. He's not always going to be president. Once he's gone, the deal's dead anyway. Plus, Congress isn't going to go for it. So, you negotiate whatever you want, but ultimately it doesn't matter. That's basically what the letter said. Now, again, maybe I'm putting my own spin on it. Maybe I'm seeing it through my own lens. We'll read the letter momentarily. It's not very long. I'm going to take another big gulp of Rubio here. I almost looked away that time. Almost. Once it's back where it belongs, it doesn't count. But okay, so this really, well, I'm going to discuss this, and I'm going to give you my opinions. There's a lot of strong opinions about this, but I am not pleased. I honestly was absolutely stunned when the news of this letter first broke, because look, I understand partisanship unfortunately creeps into just about everything. Any opportunity the Republicans have to undermine Obama, they're going to take. I get that. That's how the game is played. That's not a partisan comment. For those of you who are new to the show, you might hear me criticizing these Republicans and assume I'm a Democrat. I'm not. I'm an independent, and I'm not going to let the Democrats off the hook. Because I have some other things to talk about where Democrats have pulled this kind of stuff too. But we do have a call. Hi, welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed. Who's on the line?
Yeah, hi, it's Rich calling. How you doing, Matt?
Good, Rich. How are you?
Yeah, I was listening to your conversation about the senators sending that letter, the Republican senators sending that letter
yes.
to the leadership over there, and I'm just wondering, aren't they supposed to be held to an ethical code or a higher code, than to be so naive to be sending letters out like that when you're trying to, have a peace deal on a situation such as, obviously that magnitude of a nuclear bomb style stuff. I mean, are these people all insane? That's my question. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rich. Thanks for the call. I appreciate it. I agree with what Rich is saying there. This is not something that they should be playing partisan politics with. This is, there was actually a hashtag that was trending on Facebook the other night. It might still be hashtag 47 traitors. These people are so intent on undermining anything Obama does. And again, part of that's just partisan politics, and shame on the American people for accepting that. We got to start electing more independents, try to make this crap go away. I don't know if we'll see that in my lifetime, but, and both parties are absolutely guilty of it. Like I said, I'm an independent. Both Democrats and Republicans play all kinds of games. But this was so far over the line. I actually was stunned that they would do this to undermine the president in the midst of trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran, which I thought was something that we all wanted. I thought this was something we could all agree on, that there needs to be some sort of a deal in place, some sort of inducement for the country of Iran to not develop nukes. Right? I thought that's what we all wanted. And, Republicans complain, and some of this, I think there is something to this. I'm not necessarily criticizing Republicans for complaining about Obama's relationship or lack of a relationship with Netanyahu and Israel and whatnot. I think there is a legitimate issue there, and there is a legitimate argument to be made that Obama, in some ways, has not handled our relationship with Israel very well during his presidency. But isn't part of our relationship with Israel, isn't part of the deal kind of that we're supposed to do what we can to make sure that Iran, the country that verbally, I mean, hopefully it's all just rhetoric and nothing ever comes of it, but the country that has spoken loudly and publicly about eviscerating Israel, or members of the Iranian government, to be very specific. The typical Iranian citizen probably doesn't necessarily walk around thinking, yeah, we need to nuke Israel. But I thought part of that relationship and our obligation to Israel was to try to come to some sort of an agreement with Iran to make sure that they do not get these weapons, that they don't develop a full-blown nuclear program and become a Middle Eastern nuclear power. And yet, now you have these Republicans doing something to undercut what Obama is doing. I was absolutely stunned by this. This was a step beyond anything I ever would have imagined. I never thought that, I honestly didn't. Maybe I was naive not to see this coming. I mean, we've seen partisanship, I think, is at an all-time record high. Clearly, as this demonstrates, but I never thought we'd see this. Excuse me while I take another gulp of Rubio here. Coming Unleashed is really sometimes kind of tough on the old vocal cords there. Excuse me. I'm going to read the letter to you. This is the actual letter. In a minute, we'll talk about who actually signed this thing. An open letter to the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It has come to our attention while observing... by the way, okay, before I even... The way it's written, too, is really... It's smarmy. It's a little bit condescending, I think. On top of everything else that's wrong with it. Now, we'll start again. It has come to our attention, while observing your nuclear negotiations with our government, that you may not fully understand our constitutional system. Well, it's good of them to be concerned about whether or not the Iranians understand our system of government. Sorry, I digress, as I often do. Thus, we are writing to bring to your attention two features of our Constitution: the power to make binding international agreements and the different character of federal offices, which you should seriously consider as negotiations progress. Oh, it's so nice that these senators are looking out for the Iranians. Want to make sure that they consider everything before they make any sort of agreement with our president, who obviously, the Iranians know deep down as well as we do, he's really a secret Kenyan-born Muslim terrorist who's actually trying to destroy America. None of that's in the letter, but I mean, I'm sure that's... Anyway. Next paragraph. First, under our Constitution, while the president negotiates international agreements, Congress plays the significant role of ratifying them. True. Fair enough. In the case of a treaty, the Senate must ratify it by a 2/3 vote. A so-called congressional executive agreement requires a majority vote in both the House and the Senate, which, because of procedural rules, effectively means a 3/5 vote in the Senate. That's all true. Anything not approved by Congress is a mere executive agreement. Second, the offices of our Constitution have different characteristics. For example, the president may serve only 2 4-year terms, whereas senators may serve an unlimited number of 6-year terms. As applied today, for instance, President Obama will leave office in January 2017, while most of us will remain in office well beyond then, perhaps decades. We got to do something about that. What these two constitutional provisions mean is that we will consider any agreement regarding your nuclear weapons program that is not approved by the Congress as nothing more than an executive agreement between President Obama and Ayatollah Khomeini. The next president could revoke such an executive agreement, with the stroke of a pen, and future Congresses could modify the terms of the agreement at any time. We hope this, again, smarmy and condescending. Here's the last sentence, the coup de grace, if you will. We hope this letter enriches your knowledge of our constitutional system and promotes mutual understanding and clarity as nuclear negotiations progress. And then it's signed by Tom Cotton and all the other jackasses. By the way, I guess, if you want to take this at face value, maybe they were just trying to be helpful. Maybe they were concerned that President Obama didn't bother to explain to them up front, in the interest of fairness and operating in good faith, that, by the way, any agreement you make with me, it probably doesn't matter anyway. So just in case the president didn't tell them that, they want to make sure that they want to help the Iranians to understand, as good negotiating partners, now that they've inserted themselves into the process, that the negotiating process itself, that, by the way, you should know all the facts. And fact number one, none of this actually means anything. Again, I was stunned by this. The letter, of course, was denounced by the White House, obviously. John Earnest, who's the White House spokesman, his quote was, continuation of a partisan strategy to undermine the president's ability to conduct foreign policy. That was his characterization. And Obama noted that it was ironic for Republicans to align themselves with Iran. Let's see, his quote was, this was his exact words, "It's somewhat ironic to see some members of Congress wanting to make common cause with the hardliners in Iran. It's an unusual coalition," because obviously the hardliners in Iran, they don't want a nuclear deal either. They want to just go ahead and do what they do and build their nukes and hopefully eviscerate Israel and all that. So, like I said, this was spearheaded by Tom Cotton. I have the list here, forgive me, of the 47 Republican senators who signed it. And by the way, to their credit, there were 7 GOP senators who did not sign this letter. The list who signed it, I'm not going to read to you all 47. I'm just going to, as we scroll through, I'll pick a handful that I think are particularly significant. And as you hear these names, you'll understand immediately why they're significant. One of them, of course, Senator John McCain, who, is a very, very hawkish gentleman. It's hard to believe sometimes that I actually used to like John McCain. Back when I was a Democrat, before I became an independent, I liked John McCain, as a lot of other Democrats did. But Tom Cotton of Arkansas, of course. And we have Marco Rubio of Florida. Good timing on this. Significant because he's a prospective presidential candidate for 2016. Let's see. Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Joni Ernst of Iowa. Those are a couple of names you hear quite a bit. Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. This one, another presidential candidate, and this one bums me out because I find that I like the guy a lot in a lot of ways, although I have some concerns about him as well. And we will add this to the concerns column. Rand Paul of Kentucky also signed this letter. That's very disappointing to me. Every time I really start to like the guy, he does something that really gets under my skin. I was very disappointed to see that. Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, disappointing. Rob Portman of Ohio signed it. Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma. Again, I'm just kind of cherry picking some names here. Ted Cruz of Texas. Not shocked there. Orrin Hatch and Mike Lee, both of Utah, signed it. Mike Enzi of Wyoming. So those are a handful of the names. Like I said, a couple of those are prospective presidential candidates. Excuse me. Credit where it's due. Here are the whopping 7 Senate Republicans who opted not to sign the letter. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Jeff Flake of Arizona, which, Jeff Flake is a pretty conservative guy. But no, he opted not to sign that letter. Good for him. Daniel Coates of Indiana, who I'm not familiar with. Susan Collins of Maine, one of the last remaining moderate Republicans to serve in Congress. Senator Collins opted not to sign this letter. Good for her. Thad Cochran of Mississippi did not sign. Lamar Alexander and Bob Corker, both of Tennessee, did not sign the letter. So good for them. But most of them thought this was a great idea. Not everyone obviously does. Tim Mack wrote on thedailybeast.com, some Republicans admit that Iran letter was a dumb idea. I'll read this to you quickly. A day after releasing a letter that potentially threatened the administration's negotiations with Iran, some Republicans who signed on are realizing it was a bad call. Behind the scenes, Republicans are wondering if sending an open letter to Iran's leaders was the best strategy to keep a bad nuclear deal from being negotiated. Well, that obviously wasn't their motive. They weren't trying to keep a bad deal from being negotiated. I mean, I think in theory, if you want the best possible deal, you don't give the party you're negotiating with more information. You want them to know as little as possible, so you hold all the cards. This letter was not written in good faith. It was not part of a good faith negotiating process. That's not what they were doing, clearly. This was clearly just partisan hack BS to undermine Obama. That's all this was. I mean, anyone who can't recognize that is just being naive. Earlier this week, 47 Republican senators, well, you already know that part. But even among Republicans whose offices have signed the letter, there is some trepidation that the Iran letter injects partisanship into the Iran negotiations, which was the point. I'm convinced of that. Shifting the narrative from the content of the deal to whether Republicans are unfairly trying to undercut the president. A Senate Republican aide whose boss had signed the letter, who is anonymous, said, quote, "Before the letter, the national conversation was about Netanyahu's speech and how Obama's negotiations with Iran are leading to a terrible deal that could ultimately harm U.S. national security. Now the Obama administration and its Capitol Hill partisans are cynically trying to push the conversation away from policy and towards a deeply political pie fight over presidential and congressional prerogatives," unquote. Well, the problem with that read on it is this guy, he's a Republican aide. Of course, he's playing the partisan game too. He's saying that Obama and the Democrats are trying to, he's basically blaming this on them. Okay, so now they're trying to take this letter and capitalize on it and push this into a partisan fight over presidential, executive versus congressional branch power in this matter. That may be a byproduct, a side effect of them calling out the Republicans on this, but that doesn't make them wrong to call them out on this, because this was a terrible, terrible thing to do. However, while some on the Republican side are now rethinking the wisdom of sending a letter, none of the 47 Republican signatories are recanting their support for it or signaling an intent to do so. Senator Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, did not sign the letter. This is one of the 7 who did not sign the letter, and this is what he said about it. I didn't think it was going to further our efforts to get to a place where Congress would play the appropriate role that it should on Iran. I did not think that the letter was something that was going to help us get to an outcome that we're all seeking, and that it is Congress, Congress playing the appropriate role, unquote. So in other words, he didn't buy into the rationalization that, oh, this is going to help Congress have a greater role in the process. He wasn't buying it. Good for him. The open letter, organized by Senator Tom Cotton, was first sent around by Senate staffers in early March. Last Wednesday, with a handful of senators already committed to the letter, Cotton brought up the issue in one of the Senate GOP's regular weekly luncheons. Corker, again commenting on why he didn't sign, said, quote, "I immediately knew this was not something that, for me anyway, in my particular role, was going to be constructive. I didn't realize until this weekend that it had the kind of momentum that it had," unquote. Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona was another Republican who declined to sign the letter, telling reporters Tuesday that there was already a lot of animosity between Congress and the White House, and that the Iranian nuclear threat was, quote, "too important to divide us among partisan lines. I just didn't feel that it was appropriate or productive at this point. These are tough enough negotiations as it stands, and introducing this kind of letter, I didn't think it would be helpful," unquote. Good for him. And Jeff Flake of Arizona, I've never been a big fan, very conservative guy, much too conservative for me, me who's somewhat of a centrist, but I mean, he sounds like a statesman there. He sounds like he was thinking like a statesman. Good for him. Republican aides were taken aback by what they thought was a lighthearted attempt to signal to Iran and the public that Congress should have a role in the ongoing nuclear discussions. Two GOP aides separately described their letter as a cheeky reminder of their congressional branch's prerogatives. Oh, cheeky. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. So is that what they were going for? Is that why it seems so condescending? Is it supposed to be cheeky and I just didn't get the joke? Because I don't get the joke. In fact, another top Senate aide who remained anonymous said, "The administration has no sense of humor when it comes to how weakly they have been handling these negotiations." No, that's a pretty weak assessment of this. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest of the article, but you get the idea. I think that this is beginning to backfire on these Republicans. Megyn Kelly of Fox News every once in a while will impress me a little bit and call somebody out on something. I've always said that, I'm not a big fan of Fox News, but there've always been a couple of journalists at Fox News who I actually think, care about actual real journalism. One of them is Shepard Smith, and the other one is Chris Wallace. But Megyn Kelly every once in a while will impress me as well, as will Bill O'Reilly, in all fairness. I disagree with him probably on quite a bit, but this is an instance of Megyn Kelly impressing me. She confronted Tom Cotton over the Iran letter, asking what's the point. This comes to us via HuffPost. Megyn Kelly drilled Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, on Tuesday night over the Senate Republicans' letter to Iran leaders. On Monday, Cotton organized and drafted an open letter to Iranian leadership, signed by 46 other Republican senators. Okay, you already know that part. Kelly, we'll skip down. Kelly pushed the senator even further on Tuesday, questioning how much of an impact his letter even had. "What's the point in writing to the Iranian mullahs?" she asked. "They already dismissed it, like whatever." The Fox News host also suggested to the senator that he may have just botched any opportunity the Republicans had to gain support from the Democratic side. She said, quote, "You've offended the Obama administration, and you may have offended some of the Democrats who would have come over with the Republicans depending on what happens with this deal to have a stronger say in the Senate," unquote. She kind of called him out on that, so that's good. There has been a question also regarding whether or not a crime was committed here. Now, this gets interesting. Jen and I got into this a little bit last night on the radio edition of Unleashed. I kind of, for the second time in probably the last year, I kind of broke my own rule a little bit when I suggested that this was borderline treason. The rule being that because I have a tendency to call other people out on this when they use the word treason too lightly and loosely, and I kind of did that again last night. I said, well, I think this is borderline treason. And then I kind of took that back. I said, well, no, I don't think it's treason, but I think it's completely inappropriate, reckless, irresponsible, but not literally treason. Jen made the point that anybody can write a letter to whomever and say, you should consider this, you should consider that, particularly, if they're a government official or an elected member to the U.S. Congress. Legally, they have a right to do what they did. Okay, so it's not treason. I understand that. I think it's reprehensible, but it's not treason. But then there is a question that has arisen regarding something called the Logan Act, which is supposed to prevent people and make it a crime for anyone to undercut, intervene, try to derail peace negotiations with a foreign power, or any kind of negotiations with a foreign power. And I found something, I was looking for something online that kind of got into that and explored that idea. I found a lot of discussion about the Logan Act, but what I wanted to find was something that gets into it a little bit in depth without going totally over my heads and perhaps some of yours. I'm not an attorney. I'm no law expert, so I wanted to find something that kind of explains why or why not they violated the Logan Act without getting so far into the weeds that I can't even understand what they're talking about. So I did find something. This is a website, lawfare.com, law and then fair, FARE.com. This was a blog post written by a gentleman named Steve Vladek. This went up yesterday, and it's short, but I want to just read through this. Let's see. The second day story about the letter by 47 Republican senators to the government of Iran that Jack has discussed here has shifted to whether these senators have violated the Logan Act. As Peter Spiro suggested in this post, excuse me, before folks get too carried away with this idea, let me offer three significant caveats about the Logan Act, each of which are rather significant legal and not just political obstacles to any prosecution thereunder. Because it's looking at this point like no one's going to pursue this. The Obama administration isn't going to try to charge these senators or anything like that. This isn't going anywhere, most likely. And this kind of explains why. The text of the Logan Act makes it a crime for citizens to engage in, quote, any correspondence or intercourse with any foreign government with intent to influence the measures or conduct of any foreign government in relation to any disputes or controversies with the United States, unquote. As Peter explained yesterday, the senator's letter certainly seems to fall within this language, but critically, the citizen must act, quote, without authority of the United States, unquote. And that's kind of the argument Jen was making last night. Just to clarify, by the way, for anyone who didn't hear the show, Jen agrees that what these Republicans did was wrong. Jen is herself a Republican, but she did not defend them in terms of their action. She thinks that letter was also a terrible idea. So her and I agree on that. But she did come to their defense in terms of whether or not it was legal to do that. And this seems to bolster her argument. I was at no point convinced that it was illegal, but I was angry enough that I was throwing phrases like borderline treason around. As Peter explained yesterday, the senator's letter certainly... Okay, I'm sorry. Let me... Okay, so the citizens must act without the authority of the United States. Okay, that's where we left off. Although most assume that means without authority of the executive branch, the Logan Act itself does not specify what this term means. And the State Department told Congress in 1975 that, quote, nothing in Section 953 would appear to restrict members of the Congress from engaging in discussions with foreign officials in pursuance of their legislative duties under the Constitution, unquote. That doesn't mean members would have immunity under the Constitution's speech and debate clause. It just means the statute would arguably not apply in the first place. Combined with the rule and the constitutional concerns identified below, it seems likely that contemporary and or future courts would interpret the provision to not apply to such official communications from Congress. The Logan Act, recall, was written in 1799, well over a century before the rise of modern First and Fifth Amendment doctrine with regard to protections for speech and against prosecutions for unclear misconduct. It seems quite likely, as one district court suggested in passing in 1964, that the terms of the statute are both unconstitutionally vague and, in any event, unlikely to survive the far stricter standards contemporary courts place on such content-based restrictions on speech. So it sounds like he's kind of saying it's kind of a weak and flimsy law to try to prosecute anyone under anyway. It's vague, unconstitutionally so. Thus, even if the act does encompass official communications from members of Congress acting within their legislative capacity, it seems likely that it would not survive modern First Amendment scrutiny were it to be invoked in such a case. Finally, as Peter noted yesterday, the Logan Act has never been successfully used. Indeed, the last indictment under the act was in 1803. So you got to go all the way back to 1803 to find when someone was even indicted for this. Rubio. Although most assume this is just a practical obstacle to a contemporary prosecution, it's worth reminding folks the legal doctrine pursuant to, you know what, now we are getting a little into the weeds here. I'm not going to read the rest of this. Basically, so to sum it up, on this blog, this lawfare.com, you know, this gentleman's pointing out that, you know, it's kind of a flimsy law. You can't prosecute anyone under it, really. I mean, you got to go back to 1803 to even find an indictment, and it was merely an indictment. It was not a conviction. So, you know, you can call them traitors. I do. But, you know, they haven't necessarily done anything illegal. Now, I did mention at the top of the show, I kind of like to remind everybody from time to time that I am an independent because, you know, if I spend most of the show slamming something Republicans have done, people draw conclusions from that. But there is historically some precedent for not just Republicans, but Democrats as well to kind of insert themselves into these situations. This is from Breitbart.com, which is, of course, Andrew Breitbart, who passed away several years ago. You know, he was a conservative columnist. It's a conservative site. But, you know, you're not going to see an article like this on HuffPost, certainly. But this article points out that historically Democrats have done this as well. I don't know that any of these examples given of what Democrats have done really rises to the level, excuse me, or sinks to the depth, perhaps I should say, of what these Republicans have done. But we'll go through these in fairness because, you know, this is an example of why I don't believe in any of these people, regardless of what letter is after their name. We're going to skip the first couple paragraphs because it just restates what you already know, but skipping down. Vice President Joe Biden said that the Republican letter was, quote, beneath the dignity of an institution I revere. Might be throwing the word dignity around a bit loosely there, Mr. Vice President. In 36 years in the United States Senate, I cannot recall another instance in which senators wrote directly to advise another country, much less a longtime foreign adversary, that the president does not have the constitutional authority to reach a meaningful understanding with them, unquote. I absolutely agree with Biden on that part. Absolutely. Josh Earnest, again, the White House spokesman, said the letter was, quote, part of this I read earlier, a continuation of a partisan strategy to undermine the president's ability to conduct foreign policy and advance our national security interests around the globe, unquote. The New York Daily News headlined its front page, Traitors. John Lovett, former White House speechwriter and current failed TV sitcom writer, tweeted, quote, shame is the best medicine for these 47 Republicans, and they shall have it, unquote. Can't disagree with that. Other Democrats in the media said that Republicans were pushing war as an alternative to peace. Well, okay, that is partisan hyperbole. That I don't agree with when it comes from either side, which it does constantly. The article goes on to say, this is sheer nonsense. It was the Obama administration that suggested no deal was better than a bad deal. Well, that's just tough talk. I thought Republicans liked that kind of thing. But given the false dichotomy between deal and war, that suggestion was obviously a ruse. Okay, so somebody here doesn't get the point of that part of it, but that's okay. Nonetheless, several Republicans declined to sign. Okay, you already know that part. And then there's some discussion about the Logan Act. Legally speaking, charges under the Logan Act would be unwarranted. The Logan Act has never actually been used for prosecution, nor has its constitutionality been seriously reviewed in 200 years. And if Republicans supposedly violated the Logan Act, so did these Democrats. And here are some examples where Democrats have done things that might be questionable. Senators John Sparkman, Democrat of Alabama, oh, excuse me, and George McGovern, Democrat of South Dakota, who was also at one time a presidential candidate. The two senators visited Cuba and met with government actors there in 1975. They said they did not act on behalf of the United States, so the State Department ignored their activity. Senator Teddy Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts, in 1983, Teddy sent emissaries to the Soviets to undermine Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. According to a memo finally released in 1991 from the head of the KGB, Viktor Chebrikov, to then Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. On May 9th of this year, Senator Edward Kennedy's close friend and trusted confidant, John Tunney, was in Moscow. The senator charged Tunney to convey the following message through confidential contacts to the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov. What was the message? That Teddy would help stifle Reagan's anti-Soviet foreign policy if the Soviets would help Teddy run against Reagan in 1984. Kennedy offered to visit Moscow to arm Soviet officials with explanations regarding problems of nuclear disarmament, etc. All right. If that's all true, if that's accurate, that's pretty bad. That is pretty bad. I would call that treason, actually. There's more to that, but I don't want to run out of time. We have more examples to get to. House Speaker Jim Wright, Democrat of Texas. In 1984, 10 Democrats sent a letter to Daniel Ortega, the head of the military dictatorship in Nicaragua, praising Ortega for, quote, taking steps to open up the political process in your country, unquote. House Speaker Jim Wright signed the letter. In 1987, Wright worked out a deal to bring Ortega to the United States to visit with lawmakers. The New York Times reported there were times when the White House seemed left out of the peace process, uninformed, irritated. We don't have any idea what's going on. There's a lot more to that, but that's an example. That one doesn't seem so bad. I'm stuck on the Kennedy one. If that's true, that's really, really bad. I don't know if any of these will rise to that level or sink to that depth. Representatives Jim McDermott, Democrat of Washington, and David Bonnier, Democrat of Michigan, and Mike Thompson, Democrat of California. In 2002, I think I remember this, the three congressmen visited Baghdad to play defense for Saddam Hussein's regime. There, McDermott laid the groundwork for the Democratic Party's later rip on President George W. Bush, stating, the President of the United States will lie to the American people in order to get us into war. McDermott, along with his colleagues, suggested that the American administration give the Iraqi regime due process. You know what? I don't care about that. This country, our government, the United States government, we have a complicated history with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. He was at one time our friend. Then he became our boogeyman, and we had to go in and invade and all that. All that gets very cloudy. I don't really trust what any of these, what anyone in government says or does regarding that. All right, let's get really recent here. So the next example, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in April 2007, as the Bush administration pursued pressure against Syrian dictator Bashir Assad, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi went to visit him. There, according to the New York Times, the two discussed a variety of Middle Eastern issues, including the situations in Iraq and Lebanon and the prospects of peace talks between Syria and Israel. The Constitution of the United States delegates commander-in-chief power to the President of the United States. Section 2 clearly states, he shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. As Professor Jack Goldsmith of Harvard Law School writes, senators have a good argument that the president lacks the authority under the U.S. Constitution to negotiate a pure executive agreement in this context. Almost all major arms control agreements have been made as treaties that needed Senate consent. And the one major exception, the SALT I Treaty, was a congressional executive agreement, unquote. One who might agree, former Senator Joe Biden, whose White House profile explains that then Senator Biden played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. foreign policy. Among other elements of that role, decrying President George W. Bush's surge in Iraq as a tragic mistake and vowing, I will do everything in my power to stop it. As Tom Cotton said this morning, if Joe Biden respects the dignity of the institution of the Senate, he should be insisting that the president submit any deal to approval of the Senate, which is exactly what he did on numerous deals during his time in the Senate, unquote. By the way, while I didn't necessarily like what I would prefer if we're in the midst of some sort of military action that, we at least seem somewhat united. But although I'd prefer we see a hell of a lot less military action, period. But, I mean, Joe Biden, when he made his comment that's pointed out here, I don't think he contacted our enemies directly and said, hey, I'm going to do, or published an open letter saying, hey, I'm going to do whatever I can to get the president off your back. I mean, but I don't think that these examples offer an equivalency with what these 47 Senate Republicans have done. But I do think that they are a good series of examples explaining why the Logan Act does not apply to any of this, really. So the Logan Act seems pretty useless. Not useless. There may come a day where it will be needed for one reason or another. We have a little bit of time left. I mentioned Rand Paul earlier. Rand Paul, again, the senator from Kentucky, who I've been quite fascinated with, as I know a lot of people have. He's very interesting. He's certainly not your typical Republican in terms of the national stage. As a national figure and prospective presidential candidate, if he can resolve his ballot issue in Kentucky. I did mention that, every time he does something that, every time I really start to like the guy, I think maybe I could even potentially vote for him, then he does something that deeply disappoints me, like signing that terrible letter. But then every time he does something that deeply disappoints me, I inevitably find something else about him that impresses me. CBS News.com reports that a medical marijuana bill has been formally introduced in the Senate, and Rand Paul is one of the sponsors of the bill, along with a couple of Democrats. This is great news. I hope that now that we're seeing this play out, not just in individual states, but in Washington, that maybe we can get some real progress on a national level on this stuff. And medical marijuana, to me, is a no-brainer. If people are suffering and there's something that can help them, let them have it. I know to a lot of you that sounds like an oversimplification of what's actually a very complicated issue. I don't care. It really is that simple to me. There is something that exists, this plant that grows in nature that could benefit these people with these medical conditions, people who are suffering. Let them have it. It really is that simple. That's the bottom line. But let me read this quickly. Declaring the federal prohibition against medical marijuana out of step with science, a trio of bipartisan senators on Tuesday introduced a bill to make the drug more accessible nationwide for medical purposes. Senator Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, argued that the federal ban against any medical use for marijuana defies common sense, fiscal prudence, and compassion. Enough is enough, he said. Booker, along with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat of New York, and Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, unveiled the Compassionate Access Research Expansion and Respect States Act, which would eliminate the federal ban on production, distribution, or possession of medical marijuana in states where it's legal. Good. And by the way, for those who are wondering, well, why is that important? In states where it's already legal, why does the federal government need to do this? Right now, we have a president in Obama who has directed the Department of Justice not to prosecute people, not to go after people in states for marijuana use, possession, etc., where that individual state has made it legal. So, for example, this way, nobody has to worry about the feds, the DEA going in and raiding a dispensary in Colorado. That's not going to happen. Obama, to his credit, has said we're not going to do that. However, there is a risk that a future president may have something very different in mind. For example, Chris Christie was asked, how would you treat Colorado if you become president? And his simple two-word answer was, not well. And that obviously means that he wants to see people in Colorado put in prison for using marijuana, effectively. And that's how I take it. In spite of the current federal ban, 23 states and the District of Columbia have adopted laws approving of medical marijuana use. And 4 states and D.C. have also approved laws legalizing its recreational use. The bill would also, this is very important, the bill would also classify marijuana as a Schedule II drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Currently, marijuana is classified as a Schedule I drug, a category for substances with a high potential for abuse and with no accepted medical use, like cocaine, heroin, crack, etc. Gillibrand said, quote, "This is clearly a case of ideology getting in the way of scientific progress," unquote, stressing that evidence has shown that cannabis can treat a variety of illnesses, such as multiple sclerosis and seizures. The bill would also enable more research into medical marijuana by requiring that the DEA issue research permits to groups other than the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Currently, the organization has a monopoly on research-grade marijuana that can be used in FDA-approved research. It would also allow doctors employed by the Department of Veterans Affairs to recommend medical marijuana to veterans in states where it's legal. The bill also lets financial institutions provide banking services to medical marijuana businesses. That was a problem. The banking thing, that was a big problem in Colorado because all of a sudden you had all these banks that were saying, well, wait a minute, to us, this is drug money. We can't accept this. So that would kind of fix that. Rand Paul, a potential 2016 Republican contender, said that, quote, "Society is changing in terms of how it views medical marijuana." Marijuana reform advocates praise the bill's introduction. Quote, "The fact that 2 young Democrats with likely long political futures have teamed up with a probable 2016 Republican presidential candidate shows how medical marijuana is a nonpartisan, non-controversial issue that draws support from across the spectrum, with polls showing an overwhelming majority of American voters backing marijuana reform. You'd think taking up this proposal would be a no-brainer for legislative leaders who want to show that Congress can still get things done," unquote. That was from Tom Engel, chairman of the Marijuana Majority. So that's progress. That this bill was even introduced is progress. Like I said, to me, it's common sense. It's about compassion. Personally, I would like to see full legalization. And also, too, what is it that is so controversial about this? I mean, look, being a politician and serving in Washington, D.C., come on, we all know what it really is. It's not about doing the business of the people. It's not about representing the people. It's a job, and you spend your entire term and your entire voting record trying to get reelected. But overwhelmingly, people support medical marijuana in polling data. So what's the problem? You're not going to lose re-election if you vote in favor of medical marijuana if an overwhelming majority of Americans believe that we should be able to have medical marijuana. What is the political risk? There is none. So, I'm excited. I'm glad that Rand Paul and Kirsten Gillibrand and Cory Booker have introduced this. I hope it passes. I'm not hopeful I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic that it will. There's still just such a weird, I don't know how anyone can oppose medical marijuana. I just don't get it. But there is still opposition there among the political classes on both sides of the aisle. And it's baffling to me. There's no political risk, so just vote for it. You're not going to lose anything. There's probably, I'm sure there's other reasons, maybe in terms of who donates to these campaigns and supports them, elements there that don't want to see, the pharmaceutical industry, obviously, very, very powerful in Washington. They don't want to see medical marijuana legalized. So that probably plays into the role, probably plays into why a lot of these people won't vote for medical marijuana. But the voters, I think, will reward you favorably regardless. So that's it. We're out of time. I do want to remind everybody, of course, this coming Sunday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on our IPM Nation live station will be a very special edition of the Matt Connarton Unleashed radio edition. We're going to play all the interviews that Jen Coffey and I recorded at Liberty Forum last weekend. A lot of great stuff. This is going to be a really fun show. So please tune in Sunday night at 10 Eastern on IPMNation.com for a very special edition of the radio edition of Unleashed. And don't forget, you can also hear the radio edition of Unleashed, the regular 1-hour version, every Tuesday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern on DKRN.FM. And you can get that through IPM Nation as well. And, of course, the television edition right here every Wednesday afternoon. And this will be up no later than 10 p.m. Eastern time tonight, available on demand on IPM Nation. So that's it for now. See you all tomorrow night on the radio edition. Hopefully see you Sunday night, too, for the special. And I will talk at y'all a little bit later. Bye, everybody.